There is a family photograph taken in the autumn of 1955. Two small boys visiting their mother in a hospital room, dressed in their school clothes, looking slightly confused about why there are cameras pointed at them. The older boy is 11. The younger one is 8. They don't yet fully understand what has happened. What they know is that their father is gone and that their mother is the reason why. Those two boys, Woody and Jimmy Woodward, would spend the rest of their lives trying to outrun what happened in that hallway on Long Island. Neither of them made it. But before we get to them, we have to go back to the beginning. To a girl from Kansas with nothing but her looks and her nerve, and to the night that changed everything. The girl from Pittsburgh, Kansas. She was born Angeline Lucille CRA on December 12, 1915 in Pittsburgh, Kansas, a small town that had very little to offer a girl with her particular kind of ambition. Her father was a streetcar conductor and a retired military officer. Her mother was a school teacher and by all accounts one of the more educated women in southeastern Kansas, one of the first in her county to earn a master's degree from the University of Kansas. The parents divorced when Angeline was young, and in the aftermath of that rupture, she quietly began reconstructing herself, which is a thing people from small towns sometimes do when they decide their life is going to be somewhere else entirely. She attended Kansas City Junior College for a year, then made the decision that many ambitious young women of her era made. She moved to New York City. The year was 1937. She was 21 years old. She changed her name to in Eden, signing it cleanly on the application to the John Robert Powers Modeling Agency, the most prestigious in the city at the time. Powers represented the kind of women who appeared in Vogue and on the covers of national magazines, precisely the world and intended to enter. She got in. She was signed, photographed, and quickly picked up work as a radio actress on the side, the medium through which most Americans in the late 1930s experienced entertainment, and one that rewarded a certain kind of presence and voice. By 1940, a national poll had voted her the most beautiful girl in radio, which was both a real distinction and a reminder of how neatly the era categorized women by their faces before anything else, and took the title and kept working. To supplement her income, she danced as a showgirl at upscale Manhattan nightclubs, work that sat in an interesting social position in that era, considered glamorous enough to attract wealthy men, but not quite respectable enough for their mothers to approve of. It was at one of these clubs, Fifi's Monte Carlo on East 54th Street, that Anne's life shifted in a direction she probably hadn't entirely planned, but was prepared to take. William Woodward, Sr., walked in. He was a man of enormous consequence in New York, chairman of the Central Hanover Bank and Trust, a figure so embedded in the old money landscape of the city that his name was spoken with an involuntary lowering of the voice. He was also significantly older than Anne, married, and apparently quite taken with her. The nature of their relationship has always been the subject of speculation. Whether Anne became his mistress and for how long and what exactly he offered her. What is not speculative is what happened next. In 1942, William Woodward Sr. introduced and to his son. William Woodward Jr., known to everyone as Billy, was 22 years old, 6 feet 3 inches, handsome in a way that suggested he had never needed to work at it, and considered by more than one society publication to be the most eligible bachelor in America. He had gone to Groton and Harvard. He had served in the Navy during the war, received a Purple Heart after a torpedo attack on his ship, and upon his father's eventual death would inherit not only the banking fortune but also the Bear Stud Farm in Maryland, one of the oldest thoroughbred horse operations in the country, which had produced 3 Kentucky Derby champions. Billy Woodward was by every conventional measure of American ambition a spectacular catch. He was also drawn to, and immediately, the attraction was real, and for Billy possibly heightened by the fact that his mother despised her. Elizabeth Ogden Crider Woodward, known as Elsie, was one of the grand dames of New York society from a family so established that 3 sisters of her generation had become famous simply for being the Crider triplets. Elsie's world had very fixed boundaries, and in Eden from Pittsburgh, Kansas, a girl who had danced in nightclubs and modeled in advertisements, was not inside those boundaries. When Billy announced his intention to marry Anne, Elsie's displeasure was total. They married anyway. The ceremony took place on March 6, 1943 at St. Luke's Memorial Episcopal Church in Tacoma, Washington. A choice of venue that seems deliberate, pulling the event as far from Elsie's social orbit as the geography of the country allowed. Anne was 27. Billy was 22. She had just become Mrs. William Woodward, Jr., and the door to the grandest drawing rooms in New York had technically swung open, though the people inside those rooms would spend the next decade making sure she could feel the draft. High society in New York was built on the unspoken understanding that where you came from mattered more than what you were, and Anne had come from the wrong place. She was shut out of invitations, ignored at parties, spoken about in corners. Elsie made her disapproval known in ways that were elegant and devastating in equal measure. What Anne had was stubbornness. She watched the women around her, studied how they dressed, how they spoke, what they gave money to, which painters they admired, which causes they championed. She learned. She supported the Museum of Modern Art, the American Red Cross public television. Her collection of Chinese antiquities and couture clothing would eventually be significant enough that pieces ended up in the Metropolitan Museum of Art. By the late 1940s, she was in. The door that had been shut against her had opened, not because Elsie relented, but because Anne simply outlasted the cold shoulder. She had made herself into the kind of woman whose name appeared in the right columns for the right reasons. But behind the polish, the marriage was deteriorating. Both Anne and Billy were having affairs. They drank heavily. They argued in public with a frequency that made even their friends uncomfortable. In 1947, Billy formally asked for a divorce. Anne refused. She had climbed too far and endured too much to let go of the life she had built, and she knew that a divorce in that world, in that era, would mean losing most of it. So she held on. What nobody asked, at least not out loud, was where that left the two boys growing up inside all of it. Because Woody was born in July of 1944 and Jimmy in January of 1947, and the household they were raised in was a beautiful, cold-running, complicated place. The country estate in Oyster Bay Cove on Long Island, the Manhattan townhouse on the Upper East Side, the governesses and the formal meals and the horses. It was a world built for appearance, and it appeared well. But their parents slept in separate bedrooms by the mid-1940s, fought in front of guests, and kept their real emotional lives so buttoned up behind propriety that the two boys were left largely to make sense of it on their own. And then came Halloween night, 1955. One thing worth pausing on before we get there is what the atmosphere of the Woodward household was actually like for the two boys growing up inside it. The Long Island estate in Oyster Bay Cove was 60 acres of immaculate grounds, tennis courts, stables, a private pool, the kind of property that in the mid-1950s represented the absolute ceiling of American private wealth. The Manhattan townhouse on the Upper East Side ran with the precision of a small hotel. There were governesses, tutors, a retinue of household staff. Woody and Jimmy were dressed well, fed well, schooled privately, surrounded by the most expensive version of everything childhood could provide. What they were not surrounded by was stability. Their parents slept in separate bedrooms and had done so for years. The fights that happened in public were accompanied at home by worse ones, and had been taking prescription medication, the sleeping pills and stimulants that were almost universal among women of her social class in that decade, and Billy's drinking was heavy enough that it showed. The boys absorbed all of this the way children absorb such things, quietly, without language to name it. Woody, at 11, had developed the composure that eldest children in troubled households often develop, watchful, careful, already learning to keep his face neutral. Jimmy, at 8, had not yet learned any of that. But the night of October 30th, that autumn had been an uneasy one in Oyster Bay. A series of burglaries had been working through the estates along the north shore of Long Island. Food and ammunition stolen from the Woodwards' own property 2 nights earlier. Locks disturbed. Footprints in the grounds. The neighborhood was on edge. Both Anne and Billy had talked about it openly at dinner parties, and both were experienced hunters who kept firearms in the house as a matter of habit. On October 30th, 1955, the Woodwards attended a dinner party hosted by Florence Tucker Baker in honor of the Duke and Duchess of Windsor. It was, by all accounts, a cheerful evening. Guests, who were later asked to recall the atmosphere, remembered the couple as relaxed, even happy, though also, as was common at such events, quite drunk by the time they left. They arrived home at the Oyster Bay estate, which they called the Playhouse, at around 1 o'clock in the morning. Woody and Jimmy were asleep in their rooms. And then Billy said goodnight and went to their separate bedrooms. Both had shotguns nearby. Both were thinking about the prowler. 2 hours later, the family's dog, a spaniel called Sloppy, began barking at an open door, and heard it, woke up, and went into the darkened hallway with her 12-gauge shotgun. In the hallway, backlit by pale moonlight from a window, she saw a figure standing near the door to Billy's room. She fired twice. The first shot hit the wall. The buckshot from the second ricocheted off the doorframe in an unexpected direction, and a single pellet traveled into the temple of the man she had fired at. The figure fell. When she got close enough to see, she saw Billy. The police arrived to find and holding her husband's body, sobbing. She told them immediately that she had mistaken him for the prowler. Her lawyer, Sue Rosenblatt, arrived shortly after, a detail that would later draw its own raised eyebrows. At the insistence of Rosenblatt, and was taken to a Manhattan hospital for sedation, which meant she was spared from direct interrogation for the following 48 hours. The Nassau County prosecutor and the Oyster Bay chief of police handled the scene personally, the prominence of the victim pulling in the very top of the local law enforcement hierarchy. What happened next was one of the more remarkable things that American society with its ability to absorb and conceal managed to do. A man named Paul Worths was arrested in the days following the shooting. Wars admitted that he had been on the roof of the Woodward property on the night in question, climbing toward a window when he was frightened by the sound of gunshots and fled. Corroborated Ann's account almost completely. Whether Worths had been compensated for this confession, or whether Elsie Woodward's social and financial power had been quietly applied to smooth the outcome, was never established. But the speculation was immediate and never fully died. 3 weeks after the shooting, Ann testified before a Nassau County grand jury. The jury deliberated for 30 minutes and determined that no crime had been committed. The shooting was ruled an accident. Life magazine called it the shooting of the century. The story detonated across every level of American society. Here was the most eligible bachelor in the country, shot dead by his wife, a woman his own family had never trusted. The gossip was merciless. The consensus in the drawing rooms and had worked so hard to enter was that she had done it deliberately, that she had killed Billy before he could divorce her and strip away everything she had accumulated. Nothing was ever proven. The grand jury had spoken. But New York society had its own verdict, and it was rendered immediately and without appeal, and was banished. Within weeks of the grand jury ruling, she was gone from every guest list that mattered. The telephone stopped ringing. Invitations disappeared. Elsie, who had publicly defended her daughter-in-law in order to spare the family from trial, made her private feelings known in other ways. The 2 boys, Woody, aged 11, and Jimmy, aged 8, were packed off to boarding school in Switzerland. Elsie chose La Rosie, the most exclusive institution of its kind in Europe, a school whose alumni included royalty and heads of state, where the fees ran tens of thousands of dollars a year, and where the children of the very wealthy were sent when their families needed them to be somewhere other than where they were. The boys had slept through the shooting and had seen nothing, but they were going to spend the rest of their lives inside it all the same. And while they were crossing the Atlantic to begin their new lives at La Rosie, their mother was settling into what would become 20 years of exile, moving between Europe and New York, finding that no matter how far she traveled, the story always arrived before she did. The years in between, Elsie Woodward made the terms clear, and would receive a $500,000 annual allowance from the estate. She would have no control over the racing stables or the heirloom properties. Those things would pass to the boys. She would live with her mother-in-law temporarily in the Woodward mansion at 9 East 86th Street on Manhattan's Upper East Side before eventually relocating to Europe. She would not make trouble. In exchange, the Woodward family would not make more trouble for her. It was not a comfortable arrangement. It was not meant to be. For the boys, La Rosie was an education in a very particular kind of loneliness. The scandal had traveled with them. The school was full of children from prominent families, and prominent families talked. They were the Woodward boys, which meant people knew about their father, and people had opinions about their mother. Neither was ever given a clear explanation by anyone, not Ann, not Elsie, of what had happened the night Billy died. The silence on that subject was complete and systematic and profoundly damaging. Woody, the older of the two, managed La Rosie with something that looked from the outside like resilience. He was by several accounts a composed, intelligent young man, serious about ideas, interested in the world, capable of making friends and holding them. He graduated, returned to the United States, enrolled at Harvard. He was building something, or so it appeared. Jimmy was different from the beginning. He was the more sensitive of the two, the one for whom the unexplained circumstances of his father's death had settled deepest. The questions he couldn't ask anyone built up behind his eyes in a way that other people noticed. At La Roy he struggled. The school was beautiful and expensive and full of the children of the kind of people who would have known his parents socially, and he didn't entirely belong to it in the way Woody did. He got through it. But something about the experience, the distance, the inexplicable absence, the unspoken accusation that hung over the family name stayed with him. What happened to Jimmy after La Roy is a story that unfolds in increments, each one worse than the last. He enlisted in the United States military and served in Vietnam, volunteering partly, sources suggest, to stay close to a friend who had been drafted. The friend was killed in combat. Jimmy came home from that war, a different person from the one who went in. He came home carrying the particular kind of weight that combat places on young men, especially young men who were already carrying something heavy. And he began self-medicating in the way that generation often did with whatever could make the noise inside his head go quiet. He drank. He used hard drugs. He grew erratic and paranoid, convinced at times that he was being watched, that his television was being used to monitor him. He wrote letters to his mother, long accusatory letters written in the grip of whatever he had been drinking that day, in which he told her directly what he believed, that she had shot his father on purpose, that she was a murderer, that his entire life had been contaminated by what she had done. And received those letters. She read them and she did not answer them all. And when she did answer them, the correspondence was strained and painful in the way that all communication becomes when the fundamental question at the center of a relationship can never be honestly addressed. In 1972, Jimmy attempted to end his life by jumping from a window of a friend's apartment. He survived, breaking multiple bones in the fall. He was hospitalized. He spent time in a psychiatric facility and visited him there. The visit, by several accounts, did not go well. He asked her the question he had been asking in letters. She was unable to give him what he needed. She left in tears. Woody, through all of this, appeared to be holding. He had graduated Harvard, gotten into journalism, worked as a reporter for the New York Post for several years. He had a particular interest in the media itself, in how newspapers and magazines operated, what their responsibilities were, whether they were living up to them. In 1971, he partnered with two other writers and co-founded a publication called More, a journalism review that would spend the next several years doing exactly what its founders intended, subjecting the major American press to critical scrutiny at a time when the press most needed it. He funded the venture with part of his inheritance. He was the publisher. It was, by every account, a genuine accomplishment. More became an influential and widely read publication in media circles, the kind of thing that serious journalists actually read. He also served as deputy superintendent for the New York State Department of Banking under Governor Hugh Carey. He ran for the New York State Senate in 1978 and lost. He was doing things. He was building a life. But time was running out for and when time ran out for the thread that had been holding Jimmy together finally broke. Truman Capote and the final blow. Truman Capote had been circling and Woodward for years. He had met her in society and formed the opinion, apparently very quickly, that she was guilty of murder, a belief he nursed and embroidered over time until it had become something close to an obsession. He had a nickname for her. He called her Bang Bang. In his social circle, where the exchange of whispered devastation about mutual acquaintances was a form of currency, this was considered very funny. Capote had been working on a novel for years, a book called Answered Prayers, which he described as his masterwork, his Pranian examination of American high society from the inside. The characters were drawn directly from people he knew, identifiable, thinly renamed, their secrets and scandals, and worst moments rendered in print with the specificity that only someone who had been in those rooms could provide. He had been leaking excerpts to Esquire magazine, and each one had created exactly the kind of explosion he was aiming for. In the autumn of 1975, Esquire prepared to publish a new excerpt, a chapter called Lacket Basque, 1965. The chapter contained a character named and Hopkins, described as a murderer who had killed her husband and gotten away with it by claiming she had mistaken him for a burglar. The character was not subtle. The name was changed. Everything else was recognizable, and got word of what was coming. The precise source of that information has never been definitively established, whether she saw an advanced copy or heard from someone in the magazine world or was told by a friend who had read The Galleys. What is known is that in the days before the issue was scheduled to appear, she understood what it contained and what it was going to do to her. She had spent 20 years living with the shooting, 20 years of exile and whisper campaigns and closed doors and the low-grade constant humiliation of being the woman who had gotten away with it in the eyes of everyone who mattered to her. She had made a life of sorts in the ruins of the life she had originally built. The allowance from Elsie, the apartment on Fifth Avenue, the European traveling, the younger companions she found in the places she traveled. It was a life. It was not the life she had fought so hard to construct. On the night of October 9, 1975, she swallowed cyanide in her apartment on Fifth Avenue. Her body was discovered the following morning. No suicide note was found. She was 59 years old. The Esquire issue had not yet appeared on newsstands. Elsie Woodward, who had outlived both her son and now her daughter-in-law, reportedly said something about N's death that was both utterly cold and entirely characteristic of the world both women had inhabited. She observed that N had shot her son and that Truman had now murdered and that she supposed they didn't have to worry about that anymore. But there was still something to worry about. There were two boys who had lost their father when they were 11 and 8, who had been shipped to boarding school in Switzerland without explanation, who had grown up under the long shadow of a question that nobody would answer for them, and who had just lost their mother to a tragedy that the whole world was going to read about in a magazine. The worst was still ahead. Jimmy. In September 1978, less than 3 years after Anne's death, James Woodward, age 31, fell from the 9th floor of the Mayfair House Hotel on Park Avenue in Manhattan. He did not survive. The trajectory of what had happened to Jimmy in those 3 years since his mother died is one of the more harrowing things in this story. He had already been close to the edge before she went. The Vietnam years, the addiction, the 1972 attempt, the hospitalization. He had been trying in his way to stabilize. The letters to his mother had eventually stopped, or at least their worst periods had passed. When she died, whatever anchor had been holding that stabilization in place came loose. He had served in Vietnam alongside men who had been killed. He had come home to find his mother vilified in every newspaper in the country. He had sat with his own addiction and his own paranoia and his own inability to find any peace with what had happened to his family. And now his mother was gone. And the Capot excerpt was going to be everywhere. And every article about answered prayers was going to mention the Woodward name. And every mention was going to reopen the same wound that had never, not once in 31 years, been allowed to properly close. The years between Jimmy's return from Vietnam and his death in 1978 are the years of someone trying to hold on and losing the grip a little more with each passing season. He had no stable home. He drifted between the kind of places that people in his condition tend to drift toward. Cheap hotels, friends' apartments, the margins of a city that was indifferent to his famous last name and the catastrophe it represented. The money he had inherited from the estate was there. But money does not fix the particular damage that Jimmy had accumulated. Pays the hotel bill. It does not answer the question. Jimmy had attempted to end his life once before in 1972. He had spent time in a psychiatric hospital. People who knew him understood that the attempt in 1978 was not entirely a surprise, even as it was a devastating one. What is impossible to know, and what the family never discussed publicly, is how much the publication of Capot's excerpt contributed to his state of mind in those final weeks. But the timing is impossible to ignore. His mother died in October 1975 directly in anticipation of the Esquire piece. His death followed in September 1978 as the media machinery around answered prayers continued to turn. He had been born in January 1947 in a world where his father was America's most eligible bachelor, and his mother was working her way into the grandest drawing rooms in New York. He died at 31 without ever having had the chance to simply be a person who was not the Woodward boy. He was buried in the Woodward family plot at Woodlawn Cemetery in the Bronx alongside his father, who he had never stopped grieving for and never stopped blaming his mother for taking away. Woody buried his younger brother and kept going. For a while, it seemed like he might make it through. Woody. The last act of the Woodward story is William Woodward III Woody. And it takes longer to arrive than Jimmy's, which almost makes it harder to understand when it finally does. Woody had done, by any reasonable measure, something remarkable. He had grown up inside one of the most publicly dissected family tragedies of the 20th century, shipped off to a Swiss boarding school at 11 without explanation, raised under the Woodward name in a world that attached a particular meaning to that name. And he had built a life that from the outside looked like the life of a functioning, accomplished adult. Harvard, the New York Post, More Magazine, state banking regulation under Governor Carey, a political campaign. He married a woman named Lisa Schreiber in 1985 in Paris, a ceremony that Dominic Dunne's novel about the family had just helped bring back into public conversation since The Two Misses Grenvilles had come out that same year. He and Lisa had a daughter named Elizabeth. He was, as far as anyone could tell, doing all right. He had talked to journalists and researchers over the years about his family. He understood that the story was going to follow him everywhere, and he had largely made his peace with that. Susan Brody, who spent 8 years researching her book about the Woodward marriage, had known Woody briefly. She described him as composed and thoughtful, a man who had processed the events of his childhood in a more deliberate way than Jimmy had. He had chosen, or at least appeared, to have chosen not to be defined by what had happened on Long Island in 1955. But something started to fracture around the mid-1990s. Exactly what broke and exactly when is not entirely clear from the public record. The Woodward family maintained a wall of privacy around its members even as the family name remained in permanent circulation. What is known is that his marriage to Lisa began to unravel, and that the unraveling was accompanied by what those around him recognized as serious mental illness. By the time his wife filed legal papers as part of the divorce proceedings around 1994, accounts included descriptions of erratic and destabilizing behavior, the kind that suggested the decades of accumulated weight had finally found a place to press through. The divorce was finalized. He lost daily contact with Elizabeth. The separation from his daughter appears to have been for Woody something that the earlier losses had left him particularly ill-equipped to absorb. He had spent his adult life constructing distance from the Woodward tragedy through work, through journalism, through public service, through the discipline of being useful and competent and present in the world. The divorce took that architecture apart. What was left underneath was the 11-year-old boy who had been put on a plane to Switzerland in November 1955 without anyone sitting him down and explaining what had happened. He had revised his will, leaving the bulk of his estate, which amounted to approximately $35 million entirely to his daughter. And by May 1999, Woody Woodward was 54 years old, alone and out of road. On May 2, 1999, he jumped from the 14th floor of his Manhattan apartment. He was buried in the Woodward family plot at Woodlawn Cemetery in the Bronx, the same ground where his father Billy had been buried in 1955, where his brother Jimmy had been buried in 1978, and where Anne herself, in accordance with her own wishes, had been laid to rest in 1975. The whole family in the end in the same plot. The woman who had shot the husband and the 2 children who had lived inside the consequences of that night for the rest of their lives altogether finally in a cemetery in the Bronx. Dominic Dunne, who had been writing about the family for decades, offered a reflection on Woody's death that captured the feeling that many people had when the final chapter closed. He described Woody as a wonderful man to whom a terrible thing had happened, and he observed that it was a sad end to a doomed family. Elsie Woodward outlasted all of them. She died in 1981 at 98 years old, having witnessed the deaths of her son, her daughter-in-law, and both of her grandsons, and having said publicly and quite memorably almost nothing useful about any of it. What the Woodward children inherited from their parents was not money in the end, though there was plenty of that. What they inherited was a question that could never be answered, asked by a family that would never answer it. Woody and Jimmy were in the house on the night of October 30th, 1955. They were asleep. They heard nothing. They spent the rest of their lives wishing they knew what had happened in that hallway, what their mother had seen, what she had intended, whether it was the accident she always maintained it was, or the crime that half of New York society insisted it had been. Nobody told them. Not N, not Elsie, not the grand jury, not the journalists who wrote about the family across 5 decades. The question that had broken their family open in 1955 was still open when Woody jumped from his window in 1999. It remains open now. The story of the Woodward family has been told many times in Capot's unfinished novel, in Dominic Dunn's The Two Mrs. Grenvilles, in Susan Broad's exhaustive 1992 investigation in the FX series Feud Capot versus the Swans where, and was portrayed by Demi Moore. Each retelling has asked the same question at the center of it all. Did she know? Did she see Billy standing in that hallway and fire anyway? Or was it exactly what she always said it was? A terrified woman in the dark, reaching for a gun she had loaded because a prowler had been on her property and squeezing the trigger before she could think. The grand jury said accident. The rumors said murder. Both verdicts lived inside Woody and Jimmy for the rest of their lives. Children cannot appeal a verdict of the heart, cannot go to court and demand a retrial of what they feel to be true about the people who made them. They carry the verdict that fits the wound, and they carry it until they can't anymore. What is not in dispute is this. Both boys were in the house that night. Both slept through it. Neither was ever given a satisfactory answer, and both of them, in their different ways, and at their different speeds, were destroyed by the silence. And Woodward had climbed as far and as hard as any woman of her generation was able to climb. She had come from Pittsburgh, Kansas, with nothing but her beauty and her drive, and had made herself into one of the most recognizable socialites in New York. And the night that destroyed her, the night the shotgun fired and the buckshot ricocheted and Billy fell, also set in motion something she spent 20 years running from, something that ultimately ran faster than she did. Her 2 boys paid the full price of that night. They paid it in ways that were invisible to the world for a long time. In the formless grief of children who don't understand what they're grieving, in the particular cruelty of growing up famous for something your family did before you were old enough to consent to it. Everywhere Woody and Jimmy went, the Woodward name preceded them. At La Rosie, among the children of the European and American elite, someone always knew. In New York, in newsrooms, in government offices, someone always knew. The knowing never stopped. And the not knowing, the central devastating not knowing of what actually happened in that hallway, never resolved itself into anything a person could live with. Her 2 boys paid the full price of that night. Not all at once. That would have been almost merciful by comparison. They paid it slowly across decades in the particular way that children who grow up inside a family secret pay for it. In nightmares, in addiction, in letters written in the dark, in attempts to find some peace that never quite arrived. In a final decision that each of them made in a window in New York, in a city that had never forgotten what their mother did or failed to decide once and for all exactly what that was. If you enjoyed this video, please like and subscribe to our channel so you never miss out on more fascinating stories.